thinking about this valuation, and how do you justify it, aside from the fact that investors are willing to pay it?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. I'm really excited about the growth that we've had, and I think that's what I keep coming back to is that, over the last 2 years, we have been consistently the fastest growing crypto exchange across the world. Our volume is up massive amounts year on year and continues to climb in market share. I think that's the biggest piece of it. And then I think secondarily, us demonstrating that we can operate well on multiple fronts, including on the regulatory and consumer fronts.
Sam, why do you think the crypto bear market, Sam, hasn't impacted what's going on here? Obviously, we heard Shonali's report there about what's been happening with the numbers. Is that not something you're feeling from investors?
It's a good question, and I think that to some extent we've just seen a divergence between different companies and how much confidence investors have in them, especially during a tougher market segment. But I think there's also been a substantial public versus private divergence here, where at the same time that we've seen publicly listed equities get hit, the private venture market has been relatively more robust, and VC funds have been able to raise more money successfully.
Yeah, speaking of that private market differential and valuations here, does that create more of a reason for you to stay private and for more companies to sell to companies like you?
I think it does. I think that, we've been evaluating whether it makes sense for us to go public at some point. We're on the fence about that. We could imagine doing it. We could imagine not doing it. But I think certainly looking at the relative market environments is one of the inputs to that. And this is definitely something that's making us not feel a ton of urgency to go public.
Well, it's interesting because you have an Ontario teachers, for example, participating in this round. And I'm wondering if you're seeing more large institutional investors seek access to cryptocurrency through companies like yours rather than direct exposure.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that it's in some senses easier, even just from a custody and clearing perspective. They're well used to buying into stock, whether public or private. But if they want to buy into tokens, they'd have to figure out how do they hold them? How do they report them? What does it mean from a tax and compliance and reporting perspective? The same sorts of things that banks are going through as they investigate what it would mean for them to have any cryptocurrencies directly on their balance sheet or custodied on behalf of customers.
You've got a lot of cash to work with now, Sam, and you've expressed interest in M&A. Curious what some target areas are, especially areas that might help you compete with the likes of other deep-pocketed exchanges out there, whether it's Binance or Coinbase and beyond.
Absolutely. I think there's a few versions of this, and we've done some acquisitions sort of historically that I think point towards what we might be looking at in the future. And I do think acquisitions are a big part of this. You can look at the LedgerX acquisition, which we're really excited about, to help us build out our, licensed footprint in the United States with the CFTC. You can look at the Blockfolio acquisition from, a year and a half ago, which helped jumpstart our consumer business. I think that those are two types of deals that we are continuing to look more at and that we think might be, really value additive.
You've raised billions of dollars in the last year, but really you can potentially buy something much bigger if you wanted to borrow money or get more financing in the future for an acquisition. How big are you willing to go, Sam?
It all depends on the context. And I think one of our kind of really driving forces as a company is not having an arbitrary restriction on that. There isn't a point above which we are unwilling to go. It's just a question of what makes sense. We're willing to go substantially bigger than those if it's the right opportunity, if the company is excited about it, if we're excited about it, and if it's a really good fit for our business, we're absolutely happy to entertain it.
Obviously, FTX has really banked on some of these big sports partnerships. Tom Brady, one of those partners, and there's increasing talk about the R word, and that is retirement. And I'm curious, if Tom Brady retires, what does that mean for Tom Brady and FTX and Tom Brady and crypto? Do we see more involvement there?
It's a good question. In the end, he's the person to ask, and I can't speak for him. I don't know anything not public. I'll say what I said earlier, which is that our intramural football team has an opening at quarterback. He might be able to beat out our incumbent. That's always a possibility, but who knows?